We often speak about India's demographic dividend as though it begins in a classroom. But the truth is the foundations are laid much earlier. Long before a child meets a teacher, opens a textbook, the architecture of learning is already being built in those first formative years. So when India speaks about becoming a developed nation by the year 2047, the conversation often begins with jobs, it often begins with innovation, AI, universities. But child development experts consistently make a simpler point. The foundations are laid far earlier. In fact, research from organizations including UNICEF and the World Health Organization, they've repeatedly shown that early years are critical for cognitive, emotional, and social development. In fact, India's own policy framework, through the Ministry of Education and the National Education Policy, has also placed new emphasis on foundational learning and early childhood care. So the conversation we're about to have becomes even more urgent at a time when tech, when AI, when automation and changing labor markets are reshaping the very idea of what children will need to thrive in the future. Are we preparing children merely for school, or are we preparing them for a lifetime of learning? To begin this conversation, we have Deepika Moghal-Shetty. Thank you so much for joining us from the Ekstep Foundation.
Thank you for having me.
So far, we've been speaking about tech disruptors, artificial intelligence. The focus seems to be on universities, global education. But let's turn back the clock to the foundation. Tell us, why is it so crucial for us to discuss the early years when we are actually starting this conclave and paying attention to these big topics and themes that are so crucial?
I would sort of want to emphasize and maybe even congratulate, actually. The idea on an education summit often enough does not begin with the early years. It does not begin with rural education. It begins with all kinds of other conversations. Giving it this space actually emphasizes the importance of it. All the other things that we are talking about will pale into insignificance if we do not pay attention to the first 6, and I would go as far as saying the first 8 years of childhood, which is the National Education Policy of India is asking us to look at the first 8 years as a continuum of learning. Everything else that we aspire for, curiosity, wonder, all of these other things that we are, critical thinking, all of these wonderful things that we are talking about in spaces like this to build later, actually begins in the early years. So, and at a time where it's actually natural for the child. So you, in some ways, the things that you have to work really hard at doing later, you don't have to work at that hard at the foundation years. So also in India, I don't think we have a choice. We should not have a choice. We should invest in the early years, invest in the first 8 years of childhood as if our life depended on it. Because it does. We are talking about the fact that children are turning up in school in large numbers. 99% are in school, as Samyukta said earlier. That's great. But we also complain about them not being ready. Yeah. What does not being ready mean? It's not the child's problem, actually. It's a lack of investment, lack of intent, and lack of attention problem. Now, I want to say that at a policy level, we have articulated the intent. We now have to make the investment. And more than anything else, when I say investment, it means to invest in the building blocks that enable curiosity to thrive, invest in environments which enable childhood to thrive, invest more than anything else in the people who are making all of this happen for our children. So without this, we will be spending the next 15 years investing 2, 3, 4, 5 times trying to remedy a wrong that needn't have happened to begin with. So the only place to start a conversation in an education summit is in the early years.
Absolutely. Speaking of the early years and the crucial aspect that they play in laying the foundation, Dr. Banerjee, I want to focus on learning deficiencies. What stage do you feel from all your extensive work, do you see certain learning deficiencies that start to show through the cracks when a child is growing up before we sort of prep them for higher education, before we send them to study abroad, before we start talking about the tech disruptors? turning back to the basic learning deficiencies, how soon do you think they're traced back? Is there a crucial point in the early years which play a role in how a student shapes itself, both emotionally, physically, and mentally?
I mean, I think lots is written in the literature and in our practice about first 1,000 years, first 2,000 years, and so on. And some people say कि अगर जब बच्चा पैदा भी नहीं हुआ है, मदर अच्छा म्यूजिक सीख ले तो बच्चा काम निकलता है. I mean, there's lots of work on where should it begin. But I certainly think that in the education sphere, at least, that 3 saal is a 3-year-old they're already going somewhere. And therefore, how do we start looking at children? I won't go into deficits. I don't think this is about deficits. It's about the uneven exposure and experiences that children have as they're growing up. मेरे खुद के 2 बच्चे हैं, and now when I look back, पहला जो था उसको प्री स्कूल में डाला गया, 3 साल वो रोया, उसमें से 1 साल तो मैं भी रोई, because leaving the child in the preschool, वो भी रो रहा है, मैं भी रो रही हूँ, कभी-कभी टीचर भी रो रही है. This was all it was a difficult transition. घर से निकल के स्कूल जाना, घर में he was a happy child, but स्कूल में, प्री स्कूल में, he didn't want to be with these other children and the other adults. I have a second son who couldn't wait to go to preschool. उसको हम डे केयर में छोड़ते थे तो वो भागा भागा जाता था, and 6 बजे जब हम उसको पिकअप करने जाते थे, he was the last child to come. उसको प्री स्कूल इतना अच्छा लगता था. तो मेरे ही घर में इतना वेरिएशन है, तो आप इंडिया के बारे में सोच लो कितना वेरिएशन इंडिया में होता होगा. Now, socio-emotional, I would say that if I start with that, academic, cognitive, तो बाद में आएगा. These 2 children had very different socio-emotional makeups, शायद पैदा होने से ही. But what was the exposure that we were able to give them? How ready were they for school? How ready was the school for them? And how ready as a family was I? पहले बच्चे को छोड़ने में मुझे बड़ी दिक्कत हुई. Second को तो मैंने खुशी-खुशी से बाय कह दिया. So I think that this is really a question about, as children come into first standard, they come from very varied experiences. And how do we help before first standard and in first and second standard, help to bring up, it's not an equal playing field, but I think it's an equal opportunity for children to be able to taste the many things that go into what later becomes education or learning. Our ASER reports, annual status of education reports, we've been doing for many years. And often people think it's only about looking at basic reading and math. But shuru se hi usme early childhood bhi hai. And there if you look at, you find that children, if I look at, for example, 5-year-olds, which is 1 year before you technically come into school. In 5-year-olds, there is huge variation across the country. बहुत सारे states में बच्चे आंगनवाड़ी जाते हैं. काफ़ी states में हैं जहाँ पे private preschool में जाते हैं. There are states now, especially since the new education policy came in, where you can go to a preschool in school called Bal Vatika, Shishu Vatika, there are different names. And there are states in which children are not formally enrolled in anything, sometimes even up to the time that you go to first standard. Now, given that this is such a varied crowd, जब वो first standard की teacher इनसे मिलती है, so how is she supposed to deal with this variation? So I do think that the new education policy, the most remarkable thing, and there are several things which I think were very important, but this idea that the 3 to 6-year-old and the 7 and 8-year-olds are all part of a foundation stage. Very important, it's a stage, each is not a class. And in that foundation stage, progressively children can progress on many different things, not just, number aata hai ki nahi, and words aate hain ki nahi, and twinkle twinkle aata hai ki nahi, which is often the focus of our early childhood education. That physical, socio-emotional, cognitive, all of these things are very important. And I would say that it's remarkable to me, I've been in this business for a long time, as you can tell with my white hair, that how quickly state governments, districts, to some extent, Neeru ji ko sunne ke baad mujhe lagta hai ki panchayat level also has responded to the opportunity that early childhood is an integral part of the whole thing. And I feel that this is one of the best things. I'll stop talking. The last thing, I think, a very significant structural shift that has happened in our education system is that the age 6 as entry to first standard is now being taken very seriously. बहुत सारे हमारे पेरेंट्स ऐसे हैं जिनको लगता है कि एजुकेशन जल्दी स्टार्ट कर दो, जितनी स्कूलिंग होगी उतना अच्छा होगा. 3 साल से नीचे भी कभी कभी आपको बच्चे स्कूल में दिखते हैं. There's no harm in being somewhere, but the way that you want to approach education academically, उसके लिए एक particular cognitive age होने की ज़रूरत है, एक socio-emotional तैयारी होने की ज़रूरत है. And I think that this structural change of saying 6 years is when you come into first has been done in India when there are options of what you do before. So the Balvatikas, the Anganwadis, all of that under the new education policy are being readied for that. But I think as several people on the previous panel said, हम सबको तैयार होने की ज़रूरत है. सिर्फ सरकार के ऊपर हम नहीं छोड़ सकते हैं, सिर्फ नीति बना के नहीं हो सकता है. किसी ने पहले ज़माने में मुझे कहा था कि प्लानिंग कमीशन तो है, हाउ अबाउट एन इम्प्लीमेंटेशन कमीशन?
Absolutely.
सो आई थिंक वो इम्प्लीमेंटेशन हम ही है. हम लोगों को जिम्मेवारी लेनी है कि जो हमें लगता है कि हमारे देश के प्रगति के लिए ज़रूरी है, स्पेशली इन द अर्ली इयर्स, उसको हम कर लें. I forget what you asked me, but I said many things.
It did touch upon my question, though. And speaking of implementation, whether it's a construction site or in a state-of-the-art school, biologically, research has shown the architecture of a child's brain requires the same stimulus, its emotional safety, and play. The brain is developing faster between 0 and 3 than it ever will again, as ma'am has also just reiterated. For the child of a migrant worker born, though, ma'am, I want to take this question to you, actually, who is not just a developmental gap, they're going through many, again, it's not a level playing field, as ma'am mentioned, to say the least, to be most polite. What concretely needs to happen in the first 3 years in a child's life for them to be entering the academic space confidently?
So, thank you for the question. I think when we're asking of concrete actions in the earliest of the years, I think the fact that we are all sitting here and since morning talking about the early years, one thing is established, that the science has proven that the earliest years have the highest potential for best returns. The economics has proven that investing in the earliest years gives the highest return on investments. And the moral constitutional obligation that children, the youngest children, are also the citizens of this country, and therefore they need to get counted, and their needs must get counted, and their rights must get counted. Having said that, the focus on all children, whether a child is born at a construction site in a labor camp or the child is born in a neighborhood close to where we are sitting together, as you said, all children are equal, and at least they must get an opportunity for equal growth and development, right? So what is happening to these children who are in the margins? In fact, Robel has made my example very easy, because it is that child with that dot in the painting who drew that. Those are the children that Mobile Crushes really reaches out to. Parents are out working, and children younger than 6 years, 6-month-old, 18-month-old children are tied to cots because otherwise they'll fall and hurt themselves. And while the parents are away for working, almost 8 hours, 10 hours a day. Now, we know that these children, whether they are in urban poor spaces or in the peri-urban spaces as a construction site, or even in tribal rural spaces where there is massive migration out of the villages into the cities in search of work, very young children are growing up in an inequitable, in a deprived environment. And whilst since morning we are talking of early years and the importance of learning and nutrition and health and sanitation that has come up, I want to draw the attention of children even younger, in the first 1,000 days, which means that children from the time of conception to the first 2 birthdays of their child's life, when in a second almost 10 lakh or 1 million neurons are getting developed, the brain architecture that we referred to. It is in these environments that children need love and care. Before treating education as an input or learning as an outcome, the first foundation is that children must feel safe. The environment has to be safe and secure for the children. The adults around that young infant has to be responsive, has to be interactive. The adults could be parents. Sometimes in the case of children who do not have parents, it could be in orphanages, caregivers. The adults could be community members, extended family members. The adults could be in our Anganwadi centers or in the creches. It's the adults really who are helping those young babies, the infants, the toddlers to really grow up in a safe and secure environment. So while we are focusing on children's learning and children's easy pathway to school education, it needs a step back to think about the caring environment that is provided to the children, and therefore to invest as much in parenting programs, in early childhood development workforce programs, in the Anganwadi teachers training programs, and to recognize that it's that community that really lifts the children. Two quick things that I want to focus on before we move on is that at this youngest age, while we are focusing on the child and that infant, really the child is already born with the load of intergenerational poverty and exclusion. We know the anemia rates of women in this country. We know the sanitation levels. We know about the unemployment or the livelihood security, the food insecurity in this country. So really, children born in the margins are already growing up with this disadvantage, with the burden of intergenerational poverty leading to intergenerational inequity. So when we are talking of early childhood development programs, let's focus on how do we make equitable opportunities. And the last thing I want to say, that besides the intergenerational burden, early childhood development is also about the intersectional burden, which means that young children within that environment are also affected by gendered issues. For example, women going for work, leaving a child in a creche is a bad mother. Whereas a woman sacrificing her work is a good mother because she's nurturing for her child. Now, of course, all children must be nurtured within their families, homes. But sometimes women don't have that choice and they must go out and work. And therefore, the availability for support system for those mothers. Climate, heat, and that intersection with early childhood, poverty's intersection with early childhood, disability inclusion, children with developmental delays, and that intersection with early childhood. There are multiple intersectional issues that affect young children as they are growing. And therefore, when in an education conclave like this, when we are talking of educational foundational learning, perhaps it's time for us to go a step back and to talk about all the complex factors that a young child is born into, and how children with disadvantage who are born into impoverished families have a greater disadvantage, and to imagine that even in those communities there is hope, there is happiness, there is good health, and there is a lot of energy amongst parents. And ambition, and a lot of energy amongst parents to do better for their children. How can we support the parents to do better?
Indeed. In fact, that is something we have to collectively work towards. I must also mention that the National Curriculum Framework, that now recognizes the larger learning continuum from birth to grade 2 as a single unbroken arc. But on ground, what really needs to happen inside the Anganwadi system to build these highly trained network of educators? Siddharth's going to take us through what he does at Rocket Learning now, and also tell us the emphasis of basically prioritizing the caregiver, not just the Anganwadi facilitators as far as education is concerned, but the primary caregiver at home as well, the role that they play in the early years.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there are 2-3 things that we have learned so far. One, the theme of early childhood development is really important.
Of course.
It's a difficult problem to solve, so everyone in the community has to come together.
Yes.
When the saying goes that it takes a village to raise a child, it will
really
actually
does.
take a village to raise a child. Anganwadis are a big part of the solution, and at Rocket we work very closely with the Anganwadi worker to try to get joy in the teaching learning process for the Anganwadis. And we genuinely believe that Anganwadis are India's secret superpower. India has around 14 lakh Anganwadi centers. That is a rare phenomenon in the global south. Very few countries in the world have such an embedded community driven model of implementation. But unfortunately, Anganwadis have a lot to do. So there's health, nutrition, vaccination, multiple programs are running via the Anganwadi. So we need to get the early childhood education component into the limelight, but not just by providing guidance, which is one part of what we do, but also in generating more pride for the Anganwadi. That if the Anganwadi is seen as an early childhood educator in the community, then the pride goes up. Right? And parental engagement is another big part of it. So we at Rocket try to equip the Anganwadi and the caregivers with simple sort of daily content on what to do with the child. We call this journey something called AIM. You have to provide aspiration. कि मेरे को अच्छी टीचर बनना है या मेरे को अच्छा पेरेंट बनना है. आई नीड टू हैव इन्फॉर्मेशन. अच्छा मेरे को अब अच्छा पेरेंट बनना है तो मैं क्या करूं? What is the information that I use to actually work with the child every day? And then once I do that, I need motivation also. I need someone to say that, you've become a smart father, a smart mother. You need the government to recognize that. So I think all that has to come together under this AIM, which is aspiration, information, motivation. And this is a behavior change journey. It won't be ki, I made a curriculum or the National Curriculum Framework said something, which is a great start. But the curriculum has to reach my everyday life, right? And that behavior change has to happen. So I think we work very closely with the government to make sure that Anganwadis are now seen not just as nutritional centers, but also as educational centers. In fact, Poshan Bhi Padhai Bhi was a big scheme that was launched by the government, which actually rolled out to all 14 lakh Anganwadi centers. And another big part, of course, is convergence, that Anganwadis, parents, government all have to come together. Now, it's very difficult to monitor what's happening in 14 lakh Anganwadis. But if you have some way, even if it's basic technology or monitoring, which allows you leading indicators, कि कहाँ पे मेरे को मदद करनी है, कहाँ पे interventions needed, that is also a very big part of solving something at scale. So we also provide data-driven tasking to government. कि if I am a supervisor of 25 Anganwadis, where should I visit or where does the Anganwadi need more help? I go there and I use data to actually prioritize my day-to-day life. So I think it's a lot of behavior change for Anganwadis and parents. There's a lot of basic technology that we use via simple WhatsApp groups to actually deliver this content every day. There's a lot of sophistication and AI at the back end, but we try to keep it very simple for the communities because our communities actually live very tough lives. Like we were discussing in the last panel, 80% of the households in India have a smartphone. So how can I use a smartphone to actually influence the parent and the Anganwadi to do better activities with the child, right? And I think that's where it has to come, that the entire ecosystem around the child, including the parent, including the Anganwadi, including the government, you're influencing positively so that the child gets the best learning that is possible.
Ms. Mowgli Shetty, I'd like to ask you a question. If there was one... Sorry, I beg your pardon? Ma'am, if you could just hold on for one moment. Thank you. Ms. Mowgli Shetty, if there was one priority or one reform you could prioritize tomorrow morning that would facilitate immensely the early years of an Indian child, what would it be?
There really isn't one, is there?
We have four amongst us.
I actually think that if we had to prioritize something, I think we have enough in our kitty about what to do. But 100%. If there was one thing to prioritize, I said we should prioritize childhood. Childhood doesn't find its way in its completeness in policy frameworks, in the importance of it, in what is the value of childhood, right? And we have to approach the question of childhood not as a policy question, but also a societal question, because we constantly talk about children as how do I say it, as being deficient in some way, or how things need to be done.
As room for improvement.
As a room for improvement, or they're not yet ready for something. We're all talking about it as if a child has this desperate desire to be future ready. A child and childhood needs to be present. It needs to be visible, it needs to be celebrated, it needs to be embraced in all its possibilities. So if there was one thing, I wouldn't call it a policy shift as much as almost a trans-societal lens shift in sort of centralizing the question of childhood and the abundance of childhood. So what does it mean for India to create thriving childhoods for every child? that question, how to invest in what that idea looks like, and more than anything else, allow a 4-year-old to be a present 4-year-old. That's the only building block that can enable the child to become future ready. Future ready is an adult anxiety. It's a system anxiety. It's our desire for a future. But the child and childhood needs to be present today. Without those building blocks, the future is something else.
It is grim, to say the least.
So
Speaking of investment,
just
though,
if I may, just
sure.
sorry to interrupt you. All therefore I'm saying is centralize childhood in all its abundance. With that being at the center, everything else will fall in place. So yeah.
The emphasis that we've laid on investment, though, ma'am, what do you think is a strong pitch to make to an investor? How do we get organizations, people, entrepreneurs, philanthropists to invest in the early years? There is ample research. Besides the numbers, we can see it in our daily livelihoods. We can see it in homes, in and out, whether it's our nieces, nephews, whether it's our children. And as they say also, monkey see, monkey do. So everything starts at home, and we are emulating a lot of these things that we see. But the investment component, how do we fortify that in our country?
It's a great question. I think all of us on this panel will have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
But let me just frame it in a way when others can pick it up perhaps. Investment is in time, resources, and environments.
100%.
3 things. And there's another one, and the environments actually is about valuing the people who are producing, who are investing in this work and doing this work. Both on the caregiving side, whether it's a preschool educator or an Anganwadi worker, emphasizing and investing in programs that will actually make those jobs and those certifications valued in the world. That I think is an important level of investment one needs to put in. As far as I would say the environments actually are not just the preschools and the Anganwadis, it's also cities, it's towns, it's public spaces,
100%.
It's parks, it's libraries. It's about opening up art spaces, if I may go as far as saying that. It's about opening up spaces where childhood can thrive. Make that visible. So for philanthropists, find the ones closest to you where you can invest in these kinds of things. For urban planners, for rural development folks, for panchayats, actually look at what does it mean to invest in childhood by creating more and more spaces where childhood is visible in our neighborhood, those things. But with that, I leave the others on the panel to comment on what investment looks like, but this is a framing that I have.
There are so many arguments. I would actually have a suite of arguments and pitch
Please go
depending on, I think Sumitra already mentioned that there's a biological argument, there's an economical argument, and then of course there's a societal argument for India specifically.
Yes.
If you are looking at Viksit Bharat, you're looking at shaping the generation which will actually lead us into Viksit Bharat,
Yes.
right? Or which will actually be the inheritors of Viksit Bharat. So you need to actually equip them with the right tools. And the tools are not limited to literacy and numeracy. They are around social emotional learning. How do you adapt?
Emotional resilience,
Yes.
safety.
So much is changing around our world, right? If you have to equip the children to actually deal with that, you actually have to invest now. Otherwise, you'll be building, school drop-off programs, skilling programs. There's so much that you'll be building to address the symptoms of the problem, but not the problem itself. And at the center of it is a child, right? Like, you have to have joy in celebrating childhood. I'm from Indore, where Swachh Bharat is painted on the walls everywhere for the last 8 years. My dream is that early childhood is painted in a similar way, where spaces are celebrating the fact that we are behind the child, and then we are hoping the best for the child.
Dr. Banerjee.
I just want to add a view that both the ladies who spoke before us, who are sitting in yellow, emphasized. हम लोग जमीन से बहुत कुछ सीख सकते हैं.
बिल्कुल.
Obviously, the question of allocation of resources, policy is important. But I want to give an example which is happening now in many states. It's called a school readiness mela. It's a mela in the village, in the center of the village, where actually the whole village participates. And उसमें क्या होता है कि this fact that this is early childhood education worries me a little bit, because our education has lots of things which are not very child friendly. So at age 4, having a very tight curriculum which has to be implemented in this way, to me is actually counterproductive to having a very free and open. School readiness मेला में booths बनते हैं, हर booth में activities होते हैं, parents आते हैं बच्चों के साथ. You cannot come unless you're with your child. There's a particular village, in fact, not in Junjunu, but in Dausa, जहाँ पे ये school readiness मेला हो रहा था. तो I went to invite the sarpanch. So he heard it and he said, देखो मैं बहुत busy आदमी हूँ, मुझे बहुत सारी चीज़ें करनी होती हैं. So I said, sir आप थोड़ी देर के लिए आ जाइए. The man did not leave for 4 hours because जैसे जैसे बूथ में आके बच्चे एक्टिविटीज़ कर रहे थे, simple physical activities, walk on a crooked line. जब बच्चे नहीं चल रहे थे तो हमारे सरपंच साहब ने पार्ले बिस्किट पिलाया और कहा कि जो इसमें चलेगा ना मैं एक पार्ले बिस्किट उसको दूंगा. So this kind of involvement of parents with the actual activities. Rubal, you'll be excited to hear that one booth has up drawing karo, coloring karo, and inside the shape. Mothers were much more involved than sometimes the children. Older brothers and sisters. I think that early childhood, to get the right focus, has to be a platform on which सबको लगता है कि मेरी value इसमें मैं add कर सकता हूँ. So therefore, creating platforms. We've spoken about parents, we've spoken about teachers, but I think that if everybody in India felt कि आज रात को मैंने एक बच्चे को कहानी नहीं बताई, तो कहीं ना कहीं मेरा दिन ही अधूरा रह गया. मैंने किसी बच्चे के साथ आज drawing नहीं किया. So I feel that that is a, it's not just the writing on the wall. We should go away feeling that ये मेरी जिम्मेवारी है to play and to have fun with kids.
It's a mutual win. That's what it is. Ms. Mishra, what are your thoughts on the matter?
So I will again not repeat, lots of good points coming here. 3 things to drive the investment question, basically. I think I will again underscore what Deepika and Siddhant said, that, we're talking about teachers and teachers' pedagogy and teachers' preparation. The focus is really now to look at the ECD workforce and the ECD teachers, both in terms of their certification, skilling, their dignity, their recognition, and that needs systems level of investment, and that becomes a priority because without that, everything else will collapse. The second thing I will say is that education begins as soon as the child is born and the parents and the mother is interacting with the child.
Absolutely.
That's when the brain is starting to develop. So really with this fantastic Anganwadi system that we have, we extend that into a much more robust, active parenting program, because really even before the child reaches the Anganwadi center, the real education and the real nurturing care is happening within these homes and within these setups, informal setups, including the community. The third thing that I will say is that what we've seen since morning and what Rukmini also referred, that it's not about the child, we keep the focus. Of course, the child is the center and centering the childhood is important, but the investment and the responsibility lies within the community. So we need the sarpanches, we need the Robals and the influencers who can influence ECD and magnify the voice. We need media to talk about it. We need collectors to talk about it. We need fathers to talk about parenting and the joy of childhood. We need to really defeminize this conversation about children and mothers. So I think that's where we need to be looking at the investments to add on to this.
On that note, we must wrap this conversation. Thank you so much for bringing the crucial aspects and factors at play as far as the foundation years are concerned. The NEP says the right things. The NCF has drawn the continuum. The organizations on this stage are doing the work. The question is no longer whether we know what to do. The question is what each person in this room does next. If you are in government or policy, fund the Anganwadi worker as a professional, not a volunteer, not a helper, a trained, compensated, emotionally supported educator. That is the single highest leverage investment India can make in its human capital pipeline right now. If you are in the private sector or philanthropy, move your education investment earlier. The return on investment in the first 6 years, by the way, is not a social argument, it's an economic one. The evidence is unambiguous. Investment before the deficit compounds. And if you are a parent, an educator, a community member, protect unstructured time. Push back on the culture of optimization that is stealing childhood from children who have every advantage. Because if we cannot do it for them, we have no standing to demand it for the child on the construction site. Well, thank you so much, everyone. We'll just get a quick photo. Thank you so much.